Florence Merrick stood at the back of the dusty mercantile in Tombstone, Arizona territory, her head nearly brushing the wooden beams that supported the ceiling, and she wondered if she would ever stop wishing she could fold herself into something smaller and less noticeable. The year was 1882, and the silver mines were booming, bringing all manner of people to this rough town where justice hung by a thread and fortunes changed with the turn of a card. Florence had arrived 6 months ago with her aunt and uncle after her parents died in a fire back in Missouri. At 20 years old and standing 6 feet 2 inches tall in her stockings, she towered over most of the men in town and all of the women. Her aunt had assured her that out west, where everything was bigger and rougher, perhaps her height would not matter so much. But Aunt Margaret had been wrong. "Would you look at that beanpole trying to hide behind the flour sacks?" came a woman's shrill voice from the front of the store. Florence did not need to look to know it was Mrs. Hadley, the banker's wife, who seemed to take particular pleasure in making sure everyone noticed Florence's unusual stature. "I heard she has to have all her dresses specially made," another woman whispered, though not quietly enough. "Can you imagine the amount of fabric? It must cost a fortune." Florence kept her eyes fixed on the list her aunt had given her, though the words blurred together. She had learned early that responding only made things worse. The mocking would follow her out into the street, where children would point and laugh, where young men would make jokes about needing a ladder to court her, where even the kindly ones would shake their heads with pity as if her height were some terrible affliction. She gathered the supplies quickly, her movements efficient despite the way she had to hunch slightly to navigate the narrow aisles. The shopkeeper, Mr. Peterson, was one of the few who treated her with simple courtesy, neither staring nor commenting. He tallied her purchases without meeting her eyes, which she supposed was better than the alternative. "That will be $4.30, Miss Merrick," he said quietly. Florence counted out the coins, hyper-aware of Mrs. Hadley and her companion still lingering near the front window, their eyes boring into her back. When she turned to leave, packages balanced in her long arms, she had to duck to avoid hitting her head on a hanging lantern that she had forgotten about in her haste to escape. The two women tittered like birds. "Graceful as an ox," Mrs. Hadley said. The Arizona sun hit Florence like a physical force when she stepped outside. Allen Street was busy with the afternoon traffic of freight wagons, horsemen and pedestrians moving between the various establishments that lined the dusty thoroughfare. She kept her head down, walking quickly toward the boarding house where she lived with her aunt and uncle 3 streets over. "Miss Merrick, wait up, please." Florence closed her eyes briefly before turning. It was Tommy Chen, the young man who helped at the laundry. He was kind to her, but he was also barely 17 and stood a good 8 inches shorter than she did. The sight of them together always prompted stares and comments. "I found this handkerchief outside our shop," Tommy said, slightly out of breath from running to catch her. "It has your initials on it." Florence shifted her packages and took the small square of embroidered linen. She recognized it as one her mother had made years ago. It must have fallen from her pocket that morning when she dropped off her uncle's shirts. "Thank you, Tommy. That was very kind of you." His face flushed with pleasure at her words. "It was nothing, Miss Merrick. I would be happy to help you carry those packages if you would like." "No, thank you. I can manage just fine." She softened her refusal with a small smile, not wanting to hurt his feelings but also not wanting to encourage his obvious admiration. She had seen the way some of the other laundry workers teased him about his fondness for her, and she did not want to make his life more difficult than it already was as one of the few Chinese residents in a town that was not always welcoming. As she continued down the street, she passed the OK Corral, site of the famous gunfight that had happened just last year. The tension between the Earp brothers and the Cowboys they had shot still simmered through the town like an underground river. Her uncle, who worked as a clerk at the mining office, said Tombstone was a powder keg waiting for a match. Florence was nearly to Fremont Street when she heard the thunder of hooves behind her. She moved to the side to let the rider pass, but instead, the horse slowed to a walk beside her. She glanced up and immediately wished she had not. The rider was a stranger, tall in the saddle, with dark hair visible beneath his dusty hat, and a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin. But what caught her attention most was that even mounted, he did not tower over her the way most riders did. He was a tall man, she realized, probably taller than she was, though it was hard to tell with him on horseback. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily over the street noise. "I am looking for the boarding house run by a Mrs. Clark. Would you happen to know where that might be?" Florence's aunt was Mrs. Clark. She swallowed and gestured ahead. "2 more streets up, then turn right on Safford. It is the yellow house with the green shutters." "Much obliged." He touched the brim of his hat, and for just a moment his eyes met hers. They were an unusual color, somewhere between gray and green, like sage in the rain. Then he urged his horse forward and was gone, leaving her standing in a small cloud of dust. When Florence arrived at the boarding house, she found her aunt in a state of excited preparation. The small woman was bustling around the kitchen, her graying hair escaping its pins as she pulled out her best dishes. "Oh, Florence, there you are. Did you get everything on the list? Good, good. We have a new boarder arriving any moment. A cowboy looking for work at one of the ranches outside town. Mr. Elias Porter is his name. I want to make a good impression. You know how important the income from our boarders is, especially with your uncle's salary being what it is." Florence set the packages on the kitchen table and began unpacking them. "I met him on the street. He asked for directions." "And what did you think?" Aunt Margaret asked, not really waiting for an answer as she continued her preparations. "He seemed very polite in his letter. Said he has been working ranches in Texas, but is looking for something more permanent. The mines have made the cattle business quite profitable around here with all the people needing to be fed." What Florence thought was that he was probably like all the others, that once he saw her in the full light of the dining room that evening, he would either stare or make jokes, or simply pretend she did not exist. She had learned not to hope for anything different. The afternoon passed in the usual routine of chores. Florence helped her aunt with the dinner preparations, scrubbing potatoes and cutting vegetables for the stew. There were 3 other boarders currently in residence. An elderly prospector named Mr. Hutchins, who had arrived in Tombstone during its earliest days and refused to leave despite finding no fortune. A quiet surveyor named Mr. Wallace, who was rarely around, and a young clerk named Mr. Dobbs, who worked at one of the assay offices and who had made several awkward attempts at courting Florence before her aunt had gently discouraged him. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Florence could see through the kitchen window, she heard the front door open and her aunt's welcoming voice in the hallway. "Mr. Porter, come in, come in. I hope you found us easily enough." "Yes, madam. A kind young lady on the street gave me excellent directions." Florence dried her hands on her apron, steeling herself for the inevitable moment when he would see her again and put together that the young lady who had directed him was the freakishly tall girl who lived here. She heard them coming toward the kitchen, her aunt chattering about the house rules and meal times. "And this is my niece, Florence Merrick," Aunt Margaret said as they entered. "Florence, this is Mr. Elias Porter, our new boarder." Florence turned from the stove. unconsciously straightening to her full height the way she always did when meeting someone new, as if refusing to apologize for taking up space. Elias Porter stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and she realized with a start that he was, indeed, taller than she was. Not by much, perhaps 3 or 4 inches, but enough that for the first time in her adult life, she found herself looking up to meet someone's eyes. "We have met," Elias said, and there was something in his expression that Florence could not quite read. "On the street earlier, but I did not catch your name then." "No," Florence said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "You did not." Her aunt looked between them with obvious curiosity, but was too well-mannered to pry. "Well then, Mr. Porter, let me show you to your room. Dinner will be ready in about an hour. Florence, dear, can you finish up here?" "Yes, Aunt Margaret." As they left, Florence caught Elias glancing back at her, but she quickly turned away, focusing intently on the stew as if it required her complete concentration. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been, and she told herself it was just the surprise of meeting someone taller than herself. It did not mean anything. It could not mean anything. Dinner that evening was an awkward affair, at least for Florence. The boarding house dining room was small, with a long table that could seat 8 people if necessary. Tonight, there were 6. Her aunt and uncle at either end, with Florence, Elias, Mr. Hutchins, and Mr. Dobbs filling in the sides. Mr. Wallace had sent word he would be working late. Florence had deliberately taken her seat early, hoping to be settled before Elias came down, but she could feel his presence when he entered the room. He took the seat directly across from her, which meant she would have to look at him throughout the entire meal or obviously avoid his gaze. "So, Mr. Porter," Uncle Thomas said, ladling stew into his bowl, "what brings you to Tombstone? We have no shortage of cowboys passing through, but most do not stay long." "I have been working ranches since I was 14, Elias replied. His voice was measured, thoughtful. "Started in Texas, worked my way through New Mexico territory. I am looking to save up enough money to buy some land of my own someday. Heard there were opportunities here with the mines creating such demand for beef." "Smart thinking," Uncle Thomas said approvingly. "The Clanton Ranch and the McLaury brothers do good business supplying the town, though of course there has been some trouble." He said this last part carefully, referring to the gunfight and its aftermath without explicitly mentioning it. "I am not looking for trouble," Elias said firmly. "Just honest work and a fair wage." "Good man," Mr. Hutchins chimed in, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Too much trouble in this town already. Used to be a man could stake a claim and work it in peace. Now everything is about the big operations and hired guns." Florence listened to the conversation flow around her, contributing nothing as usual. She had learned that silence was safer, that drawing attention to herself only led to discomfort. But she found her eyes drifting to Elias despite her best intentions. He had cleaned up for dinner, his dark hair still damp from washing, his face freshly shaved. There was a scar above his right eyebrow, a thin white line that stood out against his tanned skin. As if sensing her gaze, Elias looked up and caught her watching him. Florence quickly dropped her eyes to her plate, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, but not before she saw something that might have been a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Merrick," Elias said, and Florence had no choice but to look up again. "Your aunt tells me you help with the sewing and mending here at the boarding house. That must keep you quite busy." It was a simple, polite question, the kind of thing anyone might ask to make conversation at dinner. But Florence was so unused to being directly addressed, especially by a man who was not mocking her, that for a moment she could not think how to respond. "Yes," she finally managed. "I do the mending and some dressmaking as well." "She is very talented," Aunt Margaret said proudly. "Florence can make a dress from nothing but a picture in a catalog, and her embroidery work is the finest I have ever seen." "I would like to see it sometime," Elias said, still looking at Florence, "if you would not mind showing me." Perhaps," Florence said, thoroughly flustered now. Was he making fun of her? But his expression seemed genuine, open and interested without any hint of mockery. Mr. Dobbs, who had been sulking quietly since Elias sat down, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Merrick is indeed very talented. I have tried to convince her to make items to sell at the mercantile, but she is too modest." "It is not modesty," Florence said quietly. "It is practicality. Most women in town prefer to buy their dresses from the regular shops or order from catalogs." What she did not say was that most women in town preferred not to give her their business at all, as if her height might somehow contaminate their clothing. The few customers she did have were women like herself, outsiders in various ways, who had nowhere else to turn. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Florence remained acutely aware of Elias throughout the meal. She noticed the way he listened carefully when others spoke, the way he used his utensils with surprising grace for a cowboy, the way his large hands dwarfed the water glass he lifted to his lips. And she noticed, though she tried not to, the way those strange gray-green eyes kept finding their way back to her. After dinner, Florence helped her aunt clear the dishes while the men retired to the small sitting room to smoke and talk. She could hear the rumble of their voices through the walls as she washed and dried the plates, but she could not make out individual words. "He seems nice," Aunt Margaret said casually as she put away the leftover stew. "Mr. Porter, I mean. Very polite and well-spoken for a cowboy." "I suppose so," Florence replied neutrally. Her aunt gave her a knowing look. "He is also quite tall, is he not? I do not think I have ever met a man taller than you before, dear." "Aunt Margaret," Florence said warningly, "I am just making an observation, Florence. And I saw the way he looked at you during dinner. He seemed quite interested. He was just being polite. It does not mean anything." Florence scrubbed at a pot more vigorously than necessary, trying to ignore the flutter of something in her chest that she refused to name as hope. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Aunt Margaret patted her arm gently. "You are a lovely girl, Florence, no matter what those small-minded gossips say. Someday someone will see that." Florence did not reply. She had stopped believing in someday a long time ago. The next morning was Sunday, which meant church services at the small chapel on 4th Street. Florence dreaded Sundays almost more than any other day of the week. The chapel had low ceilings and narrow pews, and she always felt like a giant trying to squeeze into a dollhouse. Worse, the church was where all the town gossips gathered, and there was nowhere to hide from their stares and whispers. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a dove gray cotton with simple black trim that she had made herself. The hem was deliberately cut longer than fashionable to accommodate her height, and she had learned to stand in ways that minimized how much she towered over everyone else. To her surprise, when she came downstairs, she found Elias waiting in the front hall, also dressed for church. He wore a clean shirt and a dark jacket that strained slightly across his broad shoulders, and he held his hat in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Merrick," he said. "I hope you do not mind if I walk with you and your family to services." "Of course not," Aunt Margaret said before Florence could respond. "We would be delighted to have you join us, Mr. Porter." Uncle Thomas emerged from his study, and the four of them set out together, walking down Safford Street toward 4th. It was a beautiful morning, the Arizona sun already warming the air even though it was not yet 8 o'clock. Florence walked slightly behind her aunt and uncle, and Elias fell into step beside her. "Have you been in Tombstone long?" he asked. 6 months. We came after my parents passed away. I am sorry for your loss. He said it simply, without the excessive sympathy that always made Florence uncomfortable. Thank you, and you? Have you always been a cowboy? Not always. My father was a farmer in Missouri. But after he died, my mother remarried a rancher, and I learned the cattle business from my stepfather. It turned out I had more talent for it than farming. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments. Florence was intensely aware of his presence beside her, of the way their strides matched naturally without either of them having to adjust their pace. She was so used to having to shorten her steps to walk with others that the ease of it felt strange and wonderful at the same time. "Miss Merrick," Elias said suddenly, his voice lower so only she could hear. "May I ask you a personal question?" Florence tensed. Here it comes, she thought. The curiosity about her height, the invasive questions about whether her parents were tall, or if she had a medical condition, or any of the other things people always wanted to know. "I suppose," she said warily. "You ever get to just be yourself in this town?" The question was so unexpected that Florence stumbled slightly on an uneven patch of road. Elias caught her elbow to steady her, his hand large and warm even through the fabric of her sleeve. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, does anyone in Tombstone see you as a person first, or are you always just the tall girl?" Florence stopped walking, forcing him to stop as well. Her aunt and uncle continued ahead, not noticing they had fallen behind. She looked up at Elias, searching his face for any sign of mockery or cruel humor, but found only genuine curiosity and something else that might have been understanding. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because I know what it is like to be defined by something you cannot control," he said. "I am not as tall as you are, I know, but I have been taller than everyone around me since I was 13 years old. People make assumptions. They think because you are big, you must be slow or stupid or good for nothing but heavy labor. They forget there is a person inside who might want more than to be a curiosity or a source of jokes." Florence felt something crack open inside her chest, a door she had kept locked for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "No one has ever asked me that before." Then they should have. Aunt Margaret called back to them. "Florence, Mr. Porter, come along or we will be late." They hurried to catch up, but Florence felt as if something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since arriving in Tombstone, she felt seen. The church service was as uncomfortable as she had anticipated. The pews were indeed narrow, and her knees pressed against the back of the bench in front of her. She caught Mrs. Hadley staring at her multiple times, whispering to the women around her. But somehow, with Elias sitting beside her in the pew, his own long legs folded uncomfortably in the small space, it bothered her less than usual. After the service, the congregation gathered outside the church for socializing. This was the part Florence dreaded most, the forced mingling where she would stand awkwardly at the edges while everyone else chatted in their comfortable circles. She was preparing to retreat to her usual spot behind the large cottonwood tree when Elias appeared at her elbow. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked. "I have not yet seen much of the town, and I would appreciate a guide." It was clearly a polite fiction. Tombstone was not large, and anyone could explore it thoroughly in an hour. But Florence found herself nodding, grateful for the excuse to escape the churchyard. They walked down 4th Street toward Allen, Tombstone's main thoroughfare. On Sunday, the wilder establishments were quieter, though the saloons never truly closed. Florence pointed out the various businesses and landmarks, narrating the town's brief but turbulent history. "The fire last year destroyed many of the original buildings," she explained. "But everything was rebuilt so quickly you can barely tell now." That is the Bird Cage Theater there, though it is more of a saloon than a proper theater. And that building is the Crystal Palace, one of the fancier establishments. Have you been inside? Elias asked. Goodness, no. Those places are not appropriate for ladies. But you must hear things living in a boarding house. Tombstone seems to have quite a reputation. Florence smiled slightly. The boarders do talk, especially Mr. Hutchins. According to him, the town is divided between the Earp faction and the Cowboy faction, and everyone is waiting to see who wins. But Uncle Thomas says most people just want to go about their business in peace. They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open desert. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and brown against the blue sky. Elias stopped and looked out at the landscape, and Florence stood beside him, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. It is beautiful out here, Elias said. Harsh but beautiful. Everything stripped down to essentials. I like it, Florence admitted. In Missouri, everything was so green and crowded. Here, there is space to breathe. Elias turned to look at her, and his expression was serious. Miss Merrick, I know we have only just met, but I feel I should be honest with you. I noticed you yesterday the moment I saw you on the street, and it is not because of your height, or not only because of that. You have a quality about you, a kind of quiet dignity that I find remarkable. I hope I am not being too forward in saying so. Florence's breath caught in her throat. She did not know what to say, how to respond to such unexpected words. Men did not notice her for anything good. They noticed her because she was freakish, unusual, a topic for jokes and stares. But Elias spoke as if he meant something entirely different. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know, and I wanted to ask if you would mind if I called on you properly. I know I am just a cowboy with little to my name except my horse and my saddle, but I am honest and hardworking, and I would like the chance to get to know you better. Why? The question burst out of Florence before she could stop it. Why would you want to court me? There are pretty girls in town, normal girls who would be happy to have your attention. Because those pretty, normal girls are not you, Elias said simply, and you are the one I want to know. Florence turned away, unable to meet his eyes. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate joke. Perhaps Mrs. Hadley had put him up to it, a way to humiliate her even further. But when she glanced back at Elias, she saw nothing but sincerity in his face. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere. He offered her his arm. Shall we head back? Your aunt will worry if we are gone too long. Florence placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, and they walked back toward the boarding house in silence. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt, Florence thought, almost like understanding. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Elias left early each morning to look for work at the various ranches that operated around Tombstone, and Florence went about her usual routines of helping her aunt with the boarding house and doing her sewing work. But in the evenings, when Elias returned for dinner, Florence found herself looking forward to seeing him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. He never pushed, never demanded an answer to his request to court her. Instead, he treated her with the same easy courtesy he showed everyone else, engaging her in conversation at meals, asking her opinion on various matters, making her feel like her thoughts had value. It was such a novel experience that Florence did not know quite what to do with it. On Wednesday afternoon, she was sitting in the parlor working on embroidering a pillowcase for one of her few customers when she heard raised voices outside. She set down her needlework and went to the window, peering through the lace curtains to see a small crowd gathered on the street. At the center of the commotion was Elias, sitting tall on his horse while 3 young men stood around him. Florence recognized them as ranch hands who worked for one of the local cattle operations and who were known for drinking too much and causing trouble in town. Even from inside the house, she could tell they were antagonizing Elias about something. Without thinking, Florence hurried outside. As she approached, she could hear what they were saying. "What is it like up there in the clouds, giant?" one of them jeered. "Can you see all the way to California?" "I bet he has to have his boots special made," another chimed in. "Regular boots would not fit those tree trunks he calls legs." Elias sat calmly in his saddle, his face impassive, not rising to their bait. But Florence could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins just a little too tightly. "Leave him alone," Florence heard herself say, her voice carrying clearly across the street. The three men turned to look at her, and their expressions shifted from mockery to something uglier. "Well, well," the first one said. "If it is not the lady giant herself, you two should get together. You could have a whole family of freaks." "Watch your mouth," Elias said, and there was steel in his voice now. The man took a step toward Florence, his friends flanking him. "Or what? You going to climb down off that horse and do something about it? I bet you move like a stuck wagon with those long legs." Florence had endured mockery her entire life. She had learned to let it wash over her, to pretend it did not hurt, to simply walk away. But something about having Elias there, about seeing him defend her, made her suddenly, blazingly angry. "At least we do not need to drink ourselves stupid to feel big," she said, her voice cold and clear. "That seems to be your specialty." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the man's face flushed red with anger, and he took another step forward, his hand moving toward his gun belt. Elias was off his horse in an instant, putting himself between Florence and the man with a speed that belied his size. "You do not want to do that," he said quietly, but there was a threat implicit in his stance, in the way he towered over the would-be aggressor despite not touching his own weapon. The tension stretched taut for a long moment. Then, as if coming to his senses, the man stepped back, his hand dropping away from his gun. "This is not worth it," he muttered. "Come on, boys, let us go get a real drink." They sauntered away with exaggerated casualness, but Florence could see they were relieved to have an excuse to retreat. Once they were gone, Elias turned to her, his expression shifting from threatening to concerned in an instant. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I should be asking you that." "I am used to such treatment." Florence was surprised to find her hands were shaking. The anger had drained away, leaving her feeling oddly hollow. "You should not have to be used to it. No one should." Elias glanced around at the few other people on the street who had witnessed the confrontation. Most were already going about their business, the excitement over. "Let us go inside." In the parlor, Florence sank into one of the worn armchairs, suddenly exhausted. Elias remained standing, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "That was foolish of you," he said finally. "Coming out here like that. Those men were drunk and stupid. They could have hurt you." "They were hurting you," Florence replied. "Or trying to. I am used to it, too. I have been dealing with bullies my whole life." He sat down across from her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "But no one has ever defended me before, not like that. I could not just stand there and watch." "No, I suppose you could not." Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Miss Merrick, Florence, may I be honest with you?" Florence nodded, not trusting her voice. "I have been thinking about what you asked me the other day, why I want to court you, and the truth is more complicated than what I said. Yes, I find you remarkable. Yes, I admire your dignity and your strength, but there is more to it than that." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "All my life I have been different. Too tall, too quiet, too serious for the rough men I work with. I have never quite fit in anywhere. And then I saw you and I thought, Here is someone who understands what it is like to be on the outside looking in. Here is someone who might not expect me to be someone I am not. Florence felt tears pricking at her eyes. You want me because I am lonely too. No, I want you because when I look at you I feel less alone. There is a difference. He reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. His palm was rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. I know we barely know each other. I know you have every reason to be cautious. But I would like the chance to show you that not everyone in this world will see you as a curiosity or a joke. Some of us might see you as simply a woman worth knowing. Florence looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, yet holding it as if it were something precious. She thought about the years of loneliness, the constant mockery, the way she had learned to make herself small emotionally even as her body refused to be small physically. And she thought about what Elias was offering. Not pity, not charity, but genuine companionship with someone who understood. Yes, she said softly. Yes, you may court me. Elias smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less careworn. Thank you, you will not regret it, I promise. He was still holding her hand when Aunt Margaret came bustling into the parlor, took one look at them, and smiled so broadly it seemed her face might split. But to her credit, she said nothing except, "Dinner will be ready in an hour, you two." That evening at dinner, Florence noticed that Elias sat a little straighter, and when he looked at her across the table, there was a warmth in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. The other boarders noticed, too. Mr. Hutchins winked at her when Elias was not looking, and even Uncle Thomas seemed pleased, nodding approvingly whenever Elias spoke. Only Mr. Dobbs seemed put out, pushing his food around his plate and excusing himself early to go to his room. He will get over it, Aunt Margaret whispered to Florence as they cleared the dishes later. And good riddance, honestly. Mr. Dobbs is a nice enough young man, but he is not right for you. Mr. Porter, on the other hand. She trailed off meaningfully, and Florence found herself blushing. Over the next few weeks, Elias's courtship of Florence was unlike anything she had ever imagined. He did not try to hide her or treat their relationship as something to be embarrassed about. Instead, he seemed almost proud to be seen with her, walking with her through town on Sunday afternoons, sitting beside her at church, bringing her small gifts like wildflowers he had found while riding the range or a particularly pretty rock he thought she might like. He had found work with a rancher named Samuel Hayes, who operated a medium-sized cattle operation about 10 miles outside of town. The work was hard, Elias told her, but fair, and Mr. Hayes paid his men on time and did not cheat them. Elias left before dawn most days and returned after sunset, but he always made time to talk with Florence in the evenings, even if only for a few minutes before exhaustion claimed him. They talked about everything. Their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Elias told her about his father's death when he was 12, about his mother's remarriage to a man who was not cruel but not particularly kind either, about learning to rely on himself from a young age. Florence told him about growing up always different, always too tall, about the way other children had teased her relentlessly, about losing her parents and feeling adrift in the world. "I used to pray that I would stop growing," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch swing behind the boarding house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Every night, I would pray that God would make me normal." "And now?" Elias asked. "Now, I think perhaps God knew what he was doing. If I were not tall, you would not have noticed me that first day on the street." "I would have noticed you regardless," Elias said. "Maybe not in the same way, but I would have noticed." Florence leaned her head against his shoulder, marveling at how natural it felt. With other men, the few times she had been close to any, She had always felt awkward and oversized. But with Elias, their proportions matched. She fit against him perfectly, as if they had been designed for each other. "Elias," she said softly, "do you ever worry about what people say about us? No, do you?" "Sometimes. Mrs. Hadley called us the giant and giantess the other day. I heard her telling someone we looked ridiculous together." Elias shifted so he could see her face. "Florence, look at me. Do you think we look ridiculous? No, neither do I, and anyone who does is not worth our time or concern." He brushed a strand of hair back from her face with gentle fingers. "You fit perfectly beside me. That is all that matters." Florence felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "You always know exactly what to say." "Not always, but for you I try." The next Sunday, Elias asked if Florence would like to ride out to see the ranch where he worked. Uncle Thomas insisted on chaperoning, though he good-naturedly agreed to ride far enough behind them to give them some privacy for conversation. Elias had borrowed a horse for Florence from Mr. Hayes, a gentle mare named Daisy, who did not seem at all bothered by having such a tall rider. Florence had not ridden much since coming to Arizona, and she had forgotten how much she enjoyed it. On horseback, everyone was more or less the same height, and there was something freeing about moving across the open land with the wind in her face. They rode out of Tombstone, following the road that led southeast toward the Dragoon Mountains. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all red rock and tough scrub, with cacti standing like sentinels against the endless sky. Elias pointed out various features of the terrain, showing her where the ranch boundaries were, where the best water sources were located, where the cattle liked to gather. "It is a good operation," he said as they paused on a small rise overlooking a valley where several dozen cattle grazed. "Mr. Hayes knows his business. He treats his men fairly and his animals well. I could learn a lot working for him. You think you will stay?" Florence asked, and she was surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. "I am planning on it, unless you have objections." Florence smiled. "No objections." They rode a little further, and Elias showed her the lined shack where he and the other hands stayed during the week when they were working cattle far from the main ranch buildings. It was a rough structure, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but Elias seemed almost fond of it. "It is not much," he said, "but it is honest work, and I am saving money. Every dollar I earn brings me closer to having my own place someday." "What kind of place do you want?" Florence asked. "Something small to start, maybe 100 acres, enough for a small herd." "A house, not fancy but solid. A barn, a corral." He paused, then added quietly, "A family if I am blessed with one." Florence felt her cheeks warm. They had been courting for nearly a month, but this was the first time Elias had mentioned anything about the future beyond vague references to someday. "That sounds lovely," she managed to say. Elias reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "I would want you to see it first, before I bought anything, to make sure it was what you wanted too." Elias, Florence did not know how to finish that sentence. What she wanted was standing right in front of her, but she was still afraid to reach for it, afraid it would dissolve like a dream if she grabbed too hard. "You do not have to say anything," Elias said. "I just want you to know my intentions. I am courting you because I am falling in love with you, Florence, and because I hope someday you might feel the same way about me." "I already do," Florence whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. Elias's face lit up with such joy that Florence felt her own heart expand to match it. He swung down from his horse and came to help her dismount, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her down. For a moment they stood there, so close she could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "May I kiss you?" Elias asked, his voice rough with emotion. Florence nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Elias cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head up slightly, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. It was her first kiss, and it was everything she had never let herself hope for, gentle and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that since the day I met you." "I am glad you did," Florence said, and they both laughed, giddy with the newness of what was growing between them. Uncle Thomas, bless him, had stayed far enough back that he had not witnessed the kiss, though he gave them both a knowing look when they returned to where he was waiting. They rode back to Tombstone in high spirits, and Florence felt as if she were floating rather than sitting in a saddle. That evening, as she helped her aunt prepare dinner, Florence found herself humming, a habit she had lost somewhere in the difficult years since her parents' death. Aunt Margaret smiled but said nothing, just squeezed her shoulder as she passed. But not everything in Tombstone was happiness and courtship. The town remained tense, the divisions that had led to the gunfight at the OK Corral still simmering beneath the surface. There were rumors of cattle rustling, of midnight meetings, of revenge being planned. Uncle Thomas came home from work one evening in early June looking worried. "There was a shooting today," he told them over dinner. "One of the Earp supporters, a man named Morgan Jones. He was found near the Oriental Saloon with a bullet in his back. They think it was retaliation for the OK Corral." "Will it never end?" Aunt Margaret asked, wringing her hands. "I thought after the Earps left town things would calm down." "Some men have long memories and short tempers," Uncle Thomas said grimly. "The marshal is trying to keep order, but it is like trying to hold back the tide with a broom." Florence glanced at Elias, who was frowning into his plate. "Do you think the ranches will be affected?" "Possibly. There has already been talk of rustlers targeting ranches that employ men who testified for the Earps. Mr. Hayes is not involved in the politics, but that does not mean much to some people." "You will be careful, won't you?" Florence asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Elias reached under the table and squeezed her hand. "Always. I did not find you just to lose you to some fool's bullet." But despite his reassurances, Florence found herself watching the door anxiously on the evenings when Elias was late returning from the ranch. She had never been much for praying, but she found herself offering up small, desperate pleas that he would stay safe, that the violence would not touch him. June passed into July, and the heat became oppressive, the kind of dry, baking heat that made even breathing feel like work. The mines continued to boom, bringing more people to Tombstone and with them, more tension. There were fights in the saloons almost nightly, and the sound of gunfire was not uncommon. But for Florence, those weeks were also some of the happiest of her life. Elias came to see her whenever he could, and their relationship deepened with every conversation, every shared laugh, every stolen moment. He told her he loved her, and she said it back, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. One evening in late July, Elias arrived at the boarding house looking tired but excited. He asked if he could speak with Florence privately, and Aunt Margaret shooed them onto the back porch with an indulgent smile. "I have news," Elias said once they were alone. "Mr. Hayes is impressed with my work. He has offered to make me foreman when his current foreman retires in the fall. It comes with a significant raise and a small house on the ranch property." "Elias, that is wonderful," Florence threw her arms around him, not caring who might see. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "There is more. I have been doing calculations, and with the raise and the money I have already saved, I will have enough to start looking at land by next spring. Small parcels, nothing grand, but enough to begin building something of my own. Florence pulled back to look at him. You are really going to do it. You are going to have your ranch. We are going to have our ranch if you will have me. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple gold ring set with a tiny diamond. It is not much. I know you deserve better, something grander, but it is all I can afford right now, and I could not wait any longer to ask. He took her hand, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. Florence Merrick, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me out here in this wild place? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I come home to every night? Florence felt tears streaming down her face, but for once, they were tears of joy rather than pain. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, of course, yes. Elias slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he was kissing her and she was kissing him back, and the future suddenly seemed bright and full of possibilities. They were married 6 weeks later, on a warm September morning, in the same church where they had first sat together in the uncomfortable pews. Aunt Margaret cried through the entire ceremony, and Uncle Thomas gave Florence away with obvious pride. Mr. Hayes attended, as did several of Elias's fellow ranch hands, and even old Mr. Hutchins cleaned up and put on his best suit for the occasion. Florence wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored muslin with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves. She had embroidered tiny flowers along the hem, each stitch a prayer for happiness. And when she walked down the aisle and saw Elias waiting for her at the altar, his face full of love and wonder, she knew those prayers had been answered. Mrs. Hadley attended the wedding, though Florence suspected it was more out of curiosity than goodwill. Florence caught her whispering to another woman during the reception at the boarding house afterward, but for once, she did not care what was being said. Let them talk. She had Elias, and that was all that mattered. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked as they stood together in the parlor, watching their guests eat cake and drink punch. "I am thinking about how different everything is from a year ago," Florence said. "How different I am. You were always remarkable. You just needed someone to remind you of it." Florence turned to him, taking both his hands in hers. "No, you did not remind me, you showed me. There is a difference." They spent their wedding night in a hotel in Tombstone, a luxury they could barely afford but that Elias insisted upon. It was awkward and tender and perfect, two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, Florence lay in Elias's arms, listening to his heartbeat, and felt more at home than she ever had in any place. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Elias replied. "And I promise I will tell you that every day for the rest of our lives." The next day, they moved into the foreman's house at the Hayes Ranch. It was small, just 3 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it was theirs. Florence threw herself into making it a home, sewing curtains for the windows, planting a small garden, arranging the few pieces of furniture they had managed to acquire. Elias worked long days managing the ranch hands and the cattle, but he always came home to her, and they would sit together in the evenings on their small porch, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Life on the ranch was different from life in town. It was isolated, with their nearest neighbors the other ranch hands and their families, most of whom lived in bunkhouses or small cabins scattered across the property. But Florence found she did not mind the solitude. She had Elias, and that was enough. She also found ways to be useful. Several of the ranch hands had wives or children who needed clothes mended or made, and Florence's sewing skills were in high demand. She charged minimal amounts, more interested in being neighborly than turning a profit, but it gave her something to do during the long days when Elias was out working cattle. As autumn turned to winter, Florence began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Elias, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally told him one evening in late November, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down and apologized for being too rough. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Florence said, laughing at his concerned expression. "I know, but I want to take care of you, both of you." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, wonder in his eyes. "A baby, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Florence asked, though she could see the answer on his face. Happy does not begin to cover it, blessed, grateful, terrified. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I want to be a good father, Florence, better than mine was, better than my stepfather. I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved no matter what." "They will," Florence assured him. "We will make sure of it." The pregnancy was not easy. Florence suffered from terrible morning sickness during the first few months, and as she grew larger, she found it increasingly difficult to move around their small house. But Elias was endlessly patient, doing extra chores without complaint, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, reassuring her when she worried about the birth. "What if the baby is too big?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. "What if my height makes everything more complicated?" "Then we will deal with it," Elias said firmly. "Together. You are strong, Florence, stronger than you know, and I will be right there with you every step of the way." Their son was born on a warm May evening in 1883 after nearly 20 hours of labor. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who was Tommy's mother, helped Florence through the birth while Elias paced outside, driven to distraction by the sounds of his wife's pain. But when Mrs. Chen finally emerged and told him he had a healthy son and Florence was doing well, he nearly knocked her over in his haste to get inside. Florence was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she was smiling as she held their baby. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Elias approached almost reverently, staring down at the tiny person wrapped in a blanket. He had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, though newborn blue, were already the same shape as Elias's. "He is perfect," Elias whispered. "We did well," Florence agreed. She looked up at her husband, seeing the tears on his cheeks. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly during the pregnancy, but had not been able to agree on one. Now, looking at their son, Elias said, "What about James? After your father," Florence felt her own eyes fill with tears. Her father had been dead for nearly 2 years, and she still missed him terribly. "James Porter. I like that." Little James was a good baby, though he was indeed large, just as they had both suspected he would be. At his 6-month checkup, the doctor in Tombstone pronounced him in the 90th percentile for both height and weight. "He will be a tall one like his parents," the doctor said. "Nothing wrong with that." Florence exchanged a glance with Elias, and they both smiled. Their son would never have to feel like a freak or an outcast, not if they could help it. He would grow up knowing he was loved and valued exactly as he was. True to his word, Mr. Hayes had been impressed enough with Elias's work as foreman to help him start looking at land. In the fall of 1883, with James just 5 months old, Elias found a parcel of 160 acres about 15 miles from the Hayes Ranch. It had a small creek that ran year-round, good grazing land, and a view of the mountains that took Florence's breath away when she first saw it. "What do you think?" Elias asked, his voice nervous. "Is it what you imagined?" Florence stood on the slight rise where Elias said he wanted to build their house, holding James on her hip, and looked out at the land that would be theirs. The grass was brown and sparse, the few trees were twisted and gnarled, and there was not a structure in sight. It was harsh and unforgiving and absolutely perfect. "It is exactly what I imagined," she said. "When do we start building?" They broke ground on the house that November. Elias did much of the work himself with help from some of the other ranch hands on their days off. It was slow going, as they could only afford to buy materials a little at a time, and Elias still had his responsibilities at the Hayes Ranch. But by the following spring, they had a small but solid two-room house with a loft for sleeping and a sturdy barn for the few cattle Elias had managed to purchase. Moving onto their own land felt like a new beginning. Florence set up her sewing area near the one window in the main room where the light was good for close work. Elias built corrals and fences, slowly expanding their small herd. James grew like a weed, toddling around the house and yard, fascinated by everything he encountered. Life was hard. There were droughts and sick cattle and months when money was so tight, they wondered how they would make it. But there were also good times. Evenings sitting on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. Mornings waking up in their own home. Small victories like bringing in their first real profit from selling cattle or Florence's growing reputation as a seamstress, bringing in extra income. By 1885, when James was 2, Florence was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma, was born in December of that year. She was smaller than James had been, but still larger than average, with her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. "We are outnumbered now," Elias joked as he held his daughter for the first time, with James climbing on his leg demanding attention. "You are outnumbered," Florence corrected. "Emma and I together can take you and James any day." Life settled into a rhythm. The ranch slowly became profitable, allowing them to hire occasional help during busy seasons. James and Emma grew, and while they were both tall for their ages, Florence and Elias made sure they never felt anything but proud of who they were. When James started school in Tombstone at age 6, Florence worried about him being teased for his height, but Elias's response was firm. "If anyone gives you trouble about being tall," he told his son, "you remember that being different is not bad. Some people will always try to make you feel small because they are small themselves, on the inside where it matters. You hold your head high and be proud of who you are. Understand?" "Yes, Papa," James said seriously. And when he did come home occasionally with stories about other children's comments, he handled it with a dignity that made Florence's heart swell with pride. Over the years, Florence and Elias's ranch grew modestly but steadily. They never became wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. They added onto the house as their family grew, eventually having 4 children in total: James, Emma, and then twin boys, Michael and Thomas, born in 1888. Florence continued her sewing work, becoming known throughout the area as the best seamstress around. Women came from as far as Bisbee and Tucson to have her make their dresses, and she charged fair prices that added nicely to the family income. She never forgot what it was like to be an outsider, and she made a point of being kind to everyone who came to her door, regardless of their circumstances. Elias proved to be as good a father as he had promised, patient and loving with all their children. He taught them to ride and rope and care for cattle, but he also taught them to read and to think for themselves and to treat everyone with respect. On Sundays, they all rode into Tombstone for church, where Florence sat with her head high, no longer caring what Mrs. Hadley or anyone else thought about her height or her family or anything else. The town itself changed over the years. The silver mines began to play out, and Tombstone's boom days faded. Many people left seeking fortune elsewhere, but some stayed, and the town settled into a quieter existence. The violence that had once seemed ready to tear everything apart gradually subsided as the main players moved on or died off. Florence sometimes thought about those early days, about how lonely and lost she had felt when she first arrived in Tombstone. It seemed like another lifetime, another person entirely. That frightened girl who had hidden behind flour sacks in the mercantile would hardly recognize the confident woman she had become, secure in the love of her husband and children, respected in the community for her skills and her kindness. One evening in the fall of 1895, Florence and Elias sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done countless times over the years. The children were inside doing their homework, their voices occasionally drifting out through the open windows. Florence was mending one of Michael's shirts, and Elias was working on oiling a saddle. "You remember the first time you saw me?" Florence asked suddenly. Elias looked up from his work, a smile playing at his lips. "Of course. You were walking down Allen Street with an armful of packages, trying to make yourself invisible and failing completely. And what did you think? I thought you were the most striking woman I had ever seen. Tall and proud despite obviously wishing you could disappear. I thought I wanted to know you." He set aside the saddle and moved to sit beside her on the porch swing. "Why do you ask?" "I was just thinking about how much has changed, how much I have changed. Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life." Elias took the mending from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her close against his side. At 45, he had a few strands of silver in his dark hair, and the sun had etched lines at the corners of his eyes, but to Florence, he was as handsome as the day she had married him. "This was always meant to be your life," he said. "You just had to wait to find it." "To find you," Florence corrected. "To find each other." He kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "You know what I said to you that day after the church service? About you fitting perfectly beside me, of course. I think about it all the time. I was right. After all these years, married, 4 children, good times and hard times, you still fit perfectly beside me. And I still love you exactly as much as I did that day, probably more." Florence tilted her face up to kiss him properly, a kiss that still had the power to make her heart race even after 13 years of marriage. "I love you, too, more than I knew it was possible to love another person." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Inside, the children were laughing about something, and Florence could smell the stew she had left simmering on the stove for their supper. This was home. This was family. This was everything she had never let herself hope for in those dark days when the world seemed determined to remind her she did not fit. But she did fit. She fit perfectly right here, in this life she and Elias had built together out of love and determination and mutual respect. She fit beside him, beside her children, in this community they had become part of. She fit in her own skin in a way she had never thought possible. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes. James grew up to be 6 feet 4 inches tall and took over much of the daily running of the ranch as Elias's back began to trouble him. Emma became a school teacher in Tombstone, beloved by her students for her patience and creativity. The twins followed different paths, Michael becoming a lawyer and Thomas a veterinarian, both staying in Arizona but traveling where their work took them. Florence and Elias became grandparents, first when Emma married a kind telegraph operator named David and had 3 children in quick succession. Then when James married a rancher's daughter and started his own family. The house that had once seemed large enough became too small for all the family gatherings, so they added on again. building a large room just for entertaining. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a party that brought together friends and family from all over Arizona territory. Nearly 100 people crowded into the ranch yard, eating and dancing and celebrating. Florence, now 53, stood beside Elias, now 56, and looked out at the assembled crowd with wonder. "We did well," Elias said, echoing her words from the day their first son was born. "We did very well," Florence agreed. "I never imagined this when I first came to Tombstone." "I never imagined any of this. That is because you could not see yourself the way I saw you, the way everyone who loves you sees you." Elias took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "Florence Porter, you are remarkable, you always have been. Only because you taught me to believe it." "No, I just reminded you of something that was always true." As the party continued around them, Florence thought back to that frightened young woman who had stood in the mercantile, wishing she could disappear. She thought about all the years of pain and loneliness, all the mocking and cruelty she had endured. And she thought about how one person, one kind man who saw her as a person rather than a curiosity, had changed everything. She had been too tall, and the town had mocked her. But the cowboy had said she fit perfectly beside him, and he had been right. She had fit beside him perfectly for 25 years, and she would fit beside him perfectly for however many years they had left. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and Florence Porter smiled, surrounded by love, finally and completely at home. As the years moved into the 1910s, Florence and Elias settled into a comfortable rhythm of semi-retirement. James had fully taken over the ranch operations, running it with the same dedication his father had shown, while also slowly expanding the operation. The Porter Ranch was now one of the most respected in the area, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. Florence continued her sewing work, though now it was more for pleasure than necessity. She had trained several younger women in the area in advanced needlework, passing on skills she had learned from her own mother years ago. Her eyesight was not what it once was, but she could still create beautiful pieces when she took her time. In 1912, Arizona became a state rather than a territory, a change that brought celebrations throughout the region. Florence and Elias attended the festivities in Tombstone, now a much quieter town than the wild place it had been when they first met. Many of the old buildings still stood, including the mercantile where Florence had once hidden, and the church where they had married. Walking through the town now, hand in hand, Florence felt like she was walking through her own history. "You remember Mrs. Hadley?" Florence asked as they passed what had once been the banker's house, now owned by someone else entirely. "The woman who used to gossip about you." "How could I forget? She apologized to me, you know. Years ago, after Emma was born, she came to the ranch and said she was sorry for the way she had treated me, said she had been unhappy in her own life and had taken it out on others." Florence smiled at the memory. "I forgave her. It felt good to let it go." "You always were more gracious than people deserved," Elias said. "Not always. But I learned that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Better to forgive and move on." They stopped in front of the church, looking at the building where they had married nearly 30 years earlier. "Want to go inside?" Elias asked. The church was empty on this weekday afternoon, cool and quiet after the heat outside. They sat in one of the back pews, the same one where they had sat on that first Sunday all those years ago when Elias had asked her to take a walk with him. "If you could go back and talk to the young woman you were then," Elias said quietly, "what would you tell her?" Florence thought about it, remembering that frightened, lonely girl. "I would tell her to hold on, That pain is not permanent, that there is someone out there who will see her for who she really is, and that when she finds him, everything will make sense. She turned to look at her husband. What would you tell the young man you were? I would tell him he is about to meet the woman who will change his life, and to not waste a single moment before telling her how he feels. Elias took her hand, just as he had so many times before. I would tell him she is worth everything. And I would tell him to buy that ring sooner because she says yes. They sat together in the quiet church, two people who had found each other against the odds, who had built a life together in a hard place, who had loved each other through everything life had thrown at them. After a while, they stood and walked back out into the Arizona sunshine, ready to head home. The years passed peacefully. Florence and Elias celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th. They welcomed more grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren as James's oldest children began to marry and have families of their own. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management, and the family name was well respected throughout the region. In 1918, Elias's health began to decline. The years of hard ranch work had taken their toll on his body, and though his spirit remained strong, his physical strength was fading. The doctor in Tombstone said his heart was wearing out, that there was nothing to be done except make him comfortable and let him rest. Florence refused to accept that this was the end. She cared for him with fierce determination, sitting by his bed, reading to him, reminding him of all the good times they had shared. Their children came to visit often, bringing the grandchildren who loved nothing more than to sit and listen to their grandfather's stories. One evening in late autumn, as the sun was setting over the mountains they had loved for so many years, Elias called Florence to his bedside. He was weak, but his eyes were still clear, still full of the love he had always shown her. "Come here," he said softly, and she sat beside him on the bed, taking his hand in both of hers. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He was tired. He was ready. "I feel blessed," Elias said. "That is what I feel, blessed to have had this life with you, blessed to have known your love, blessed beyond measure." Tears streamed down Florence's face. "Do not talk like you are saying goodbye. You are going to get better. You have to get better." "Florence, my love, listen to me." Elias squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "I have lived a good life, better than I ever dreamed possible, and that is because of you. You made every day worth living. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You stood by me through everything. I could not have asked for more. But I am not ready to lose you," Florence whispered. "I do not know how to be without you. You will never be without me. I will always be with you, in every sunrise you watch from our porch, in every stitch you sew, in our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I will be there." He reached up with his other hand to touch her face. "You are the strongest person I know, Florence. You survived everything life threw at you before we met, and you will survive this too. And someday, when your time comes, I will be waiting for you. You will find me, and I will tell you again that you fit perfectly beside me." Florence leaned down and kissed him, tasting salt from her tears. "I love you. I have loved you since the moment you told me I was remarkable. I will love you until the end of time." "And I love you," Elias said, "always and forever." He died peacefully that night, with Florence holding his hand and their children gathered around. He simply slipped away between one breath and the next, and Florence felt as if a part of her soul went with him. The funeral was held at the church in Tombstone, the same church where they had married 43 years earlier. It seemed as if the entire town and half the territory came to pay their respects. Elias had touched many lives with his kindness, his fairness, and his unwavering integrity, and people came from miles around to say goodbye. Florence stood by his grave in the small cemetery on the edge of town, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and felt both devastated and grateful. Devastated to have lost the love of her life, but grateful to have had him at all. Not everyone found what she and Elias had found together. Not everyone experienced that kind of love. The weeks and months after Elias's death were difficult. Florence had never lived alone, had never been without him since the day they married. The ranch felt empty despite being full of family, and she caught herself multiple times turning to say something to Elias before remembering he was gone. But slowly, gradually, she found her way back to living. She focused on her sewing, on her grandchildren, on the small daily tasks that gave shape and meaning to her days. She sat on the porch every evening watching the sunset, talking to Elias as if he were still beside her, telling him about her day and the family news. James worried about her living alone at the ranch house, but Florence refused to move into town or live with one of her children. "This is my home," she told him firmly. "This is where your father and I built our life together. I am not leaving it. But Mama, you are 70 years old. What if something happens? Then something happens, but I will not spend my remaining years being afraid to live." She softened her tone. "I appreciate your concern, son, but I need to do this my way." Florence lived at the ranch for another 12 years after Elias's death, staying active and involved in her family's lives. She saw her great-grandchildren grow, saw Arizona change from a rough frontier state into something more settled and modern. She watched as automobiles became common and electricity came to the ranch, as the world moved faster and faster into a new era. But she never forgot where she came from, or the journey she had taken to get here. She told her grandchildren stories about the old days, about Tombstone when it was wild and dangerous, about meeting their grandfather and falling in love, about building a life from nothing but determination and hope. "Tell us again about how Grandpa proposed," her granddaughter Sarah would beg, and Florence would smile and tell the story once more, remembering that evening on the back porch, the tiny diamond ring, the way her heart had felt like it might burst from happiness. In the spring of 1930, at the age of 82, Florence's health began to fail. She had lived a long, full life, and she was ready for it to end. She gathered her children around her bedside and told them how proud she was of all of them, how grateful she was for the family they had become. "Do not grieve too long for me," she told them. "I have had a wonderful life. Your father gave me everything I ever wanted, and you children and your families have been my greatest joy. When I am gone, remember me with smiles, not tears." On a warm May evening, with the windows open to let in the desert breeze and the last light of sunset painting her bedroom walls gold, Florence Merrick Porter closed her eyes and died peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside Elias in the Tombstone cemetery, and her gravestone read simply, "Beloved wife, mother, and friend, she fit perfectly here." At her funeral, her great-grandson, Elias James Porter, named for his great-grandfather, gave a eulogy that moved everyone present. He spoke of his great-grandmother's strength, her kindness, her resilience in the face of cruelty. He spoke of the love story that had begun in the dusty streets of Tombstone all those years ago, and how that love had created a legacy that would live on through generations. "My great-grandmother taught us that being different is not a weakness," he said, his voice carrying through the packed church. "She taught us that true love sees beyond surface appearances to the person underneath. She taught us that home is not a place, but the people you love. And she taught us, through her example, that a life well lived is measured not in wealth or fame, but in the love you give and receive." After the service, the family gathered at the ranch for a meal, just as Florence and Elias had done for so many holidays and celebrations over the years. The house was full of laughter and memories, of children running through the rooms, of adults sharing stories about the woman who had brought them all together. And if occasionally someone felt a presence on the porch, or caught the faint scent of Florence's lavender perfume, or heard what might have been two voices in quiet conversation on the evening breeze, well, they smiled and said nothing, because everyone knew that Florence and Elias were together again, just as he had promised, and that they would always be there, watching over the family they had created, perfectly fitted beside each other for all eternity. The Porter Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, and the story of Florence and Elias became family legend. Every new bride who married into the family was told the tale of how their love began, of how a tall woman who had been mocked by the town found a cowboy who saw her true worth, of how together they built something that lasted beyond their lifetimes. And whenever someone in the family felt like they did not quite fit, whenever they felt like an outsider or different or less than, they would remember Florence Merrick Porter. They would remember that she had been 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when women were supposed to be petite and delicate, that she had been mocked and ridiculed and made to feel like she was wrong just for existing. But she had survived it all, had found love and happiness and built a remarkable life. And if Florence could do it, if she could take all that pain and turn it into something beautiful, then so could they. Because they were her legacy, her descendants, and they carried her strength in their bones and her resilience in their hearts. The last surviving person who remembered Florence and Elias personally was their daughter Emma, who lived to be 96 years old. Before she died in 1981, she gave an interview to a local historian who was documenting the history of early Arizona. When asked what she remembered most about her parents, Emma smiled and said simply, "They fit perfectly together. Everyone who saw them knew it. My father used to say that Mama was made for him, and he for her, and that everything in their lives had led them to that dusty street in Tombstone where they first met. I believe he was right. I never saw two people more suited to each other, more devoted, more completely in love even after decades of marriage. They showed me what real love looks like, and I have been blessed to find it for myself because they taught me what to look for." When Emma died, she was buried in the family plot beside her husband, near her parents. The cemetery in Tombstone had grown over the years, filled with the stories of hundreds of people who had lived and loved and died in this place. But none of the stories were quite as enduring as the tale of the woman who was too tall and the cowboy who told her she fit perfectly beside him, because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardship or the mockery or the difficult times. What mattered was the love, the partnership, the family built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. What mattered was that two people who might easily have remained alone in their separate loneliness had found each other and created something lasting. The old boarding house in Tombstone where Florence had lived with her aunt and uncle eventually became a museum, preserved as an example of frontier life. Visitors walked through the rooms where Florence and Elias had fallen in love, though most of them did not know the story. The mercantile where Florence had once hidden was long gone, replaced by a modern building. The church where they married still stood, though services were infrequent now. But the land they had claimed, the ranch they had built, the family they had created, all of it remained, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they saw each other truly and loved each other completely. And sometimes, on warm evenings when the sun set over the mountains in shades of gold and purple, people swore they could see two figures on the porch of the old ranch house, sitting close together, perfectly fitted side by side, watching the desert bloom pink with twilight. They were just shadows, just tricks of the light, but they were also something more. A reminder that real love does not end with death, that some bonds are too strong to be broken by anything as simple as mortality. Florence had been too tall, and the town had mocked her. But the cowboy said she fit perfectly beside him, and he had been right. She had fit perfectly for a lifetime, and she fit perfectly still, now and always. Two souls bound together by a love that had changed everything.